Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorers 2022 Halloween special. In this episode, we're going to introduce you to some of the most gruesome true stories of police brutality, murder and mayhem, all from the Cotswold region. Come with us if you dare. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you want to hear more spooky stories from me, check out the link in the description. On the 7th of September 1846, a feast was held at Great Barrington, organised by George Talbot Rice, the 3rd Baron Dynevor. He gave it to thank the many villagers who worked on his estate, Barrington Park. Local feasts of this kind had been known to end in argument and violence as a result of alcoholic overindulgence, but on this occasion it had been a peaceful affair. When the evening came to an end, the guests dispersed, many of them to continue their fun in the local inns. One of these inns was the Fox in the village of Windrush. A couple of groups arrived here from the feast, threw all the money they had between them onto the bar and told the landlord to keep the food and drink coming. One party, rather more sober and respectful than others, was led by one Reuben Busby, and included, amongst others, his friend John Clifford. As the evening progressed, the mood in the pub changed when a drunken man, not part of Reuben's group, created something of a disturbance and smashed a glass on the floor. The landlord tried to get the man to pay for the damage, which he emphatically refused to do, and so the police were called. Sergeant Adams and two of his constables soon arrived, one of them a James Probert, an over-keen young man who pushed an elderly woman to the ground as he entered the pub. Reuben's friend Clifford saw no need for this kind of treatment and complained of the police's unnecessary aggression, and all others present supported his view. At this rather sensitive moment, the second constable left the room, and Probert drew his truncheon. He began striking people at random, swinging it left and right. This despite the fact that no one in the pub was causing any kind of trouble. The sergeant stood at the inn's door, watching, clearly without any intention of stopping his subordinate's violent outburst. Clifford was hit several times by the swinging truncheon, and falling to the floor would have been in very serious trouble if not for the prompt action of the others in the inn. They dragged him out of the room to safety. Probert then turned his attention to Reuben himself, who'd been sitting quietly at a table minding his own business. He struck him on the crown of his head, and he fell to the ground, apparently lifeless. It took pretty much everybody else in the pub, including the landlord, to stop Probert from continuing his violent spree, and Reuben was carried outside to get some air. Even with the help of a local surgeon from Burford, who quickly arrived to help, Reuben's case was hopeless. He died that night of his injuries. Clifford was also severely injured. Such was the anger over Probert's behaviour that, even before it was known Reuben had died, he was taken into custody for his own protection, with the help of another officer from Great Barrington. At Reuben's inquest, Probert tried to claim that he had acted in self-defence. This went squarely against the accounts of 13 witnesses. They were all cross-examined by Probert's solicitor, but all remained firm in their story that there had been no rioting at the inn, and nothing warranted the kind of violence Probert had dished out. The coroner, one John Barnett, gave the jury 3 verdict choices: justifiable homicide, manslaughter, or murder. After some deliberation, they decided on manslaughter, and on the 19th of September, Probert was formally committed for trial. Even though the policeman had only been charged with the lesser crime of manslaughter, and despite the clear evidence against him, the jury acquitted him.
It turned out later that the local lawyer prosecuting Probert had known him for years. Indeed, according to Probert's employment record, they'd lived together for 3 years. Was it any surprise, then, that he was acquitted? The local police's reputation at this time was far from great, and examples like this caused faith in the rural police to decline even further. As long as young men with little experience were employed supposedly to protect the local population, these problems would inevitably continue.
On the other side of the A40, in the ancient wool town of Northleach, a prison had been built in the 1790s, which at the time was considered a leading example of modern correctional incarceration.
In October 1842, a sawyer named Charles Beale died of tuberculosis at his father's house in Cheltenham. He was just 23 years old. His illness and subsequent death sparked an inquiry that shook the government and people all across Victorian England. The inquiry was into the conditions at Northleach House of Correction, just a few miles along the A40 from the Fox Inn. Charles had spent 6 months as a prisoner here in Northleach. He went in healthy, but came out with badly diseased lungs. 4 other recently discharged prisoners also complained about the treatment they received whilst incarcerated here. When he gave evidence to the inquiry, his ominous final words were that if he died, it would be because he had been murdered by the treatment given to him in Northleach Prison.
Charles was born in Cheltenham and had a poor upbringing. He followed in his father's footsteps to become a sawyer. He partnered up with a man called Joseph Rowley, and in order to make a success of their business, they needed materials to work with. They stole 2 mahogany boards from a man called Jeremiah Wheeler. They were caught red-handed and charged with theft. Each was given a term of 6 months' imprisonment to be served at Northleach House of Correction. At the time, there was already an inquiry underway into the conditions at the prison. Several applications for parish poor relief had been made by people who claimed they were disabled and unable to work as a result of their treatment there. William Hollis was appointed to conduct the inquiry, which started on the 22nd of September 1842, by which time Charles Beale was already gravely ill. Charles himself had applied for parish relief before the start of the inquiry, and Hollis recorded that he was so ill he could barely stand.
It seems it wasn't so much how prisoners were treated by the officers in the prison, but more the excessive labour they were expected to do, the quality of the prison food, and the damp, cold cells. It seems people entered in perfectly good health and left malnourished, ill, and unable to work. Charles's partner Joseph was also taken ill during this time there, blaming it on being overworked and not having enough to eat. Several other healthy young men who committed petty crimes were subjected to the same treatment. Illiterate labourer Joseph Wilson, rogue and vagabond John Newton, and labourer John Cook amongst them. The latter attended the inquiry in a wheelchair, which only emphasised just how bad the situation was at the prison.
Just before his death, Charles recounted a vivid picture of life in Northleach. He said that the work was enough to kill an horse. After conducting a post-mortem on his emaciated body, the surgeon declared that the tuberculosis in Charles's lungs had certainly developed over the last 2 to 3 months. This piece of evidence piqued the interest of many high up in local and national government, and the inquiry became national news. People began to take note. They started to realize that many working men were being sent to prison for minor infringements from where they emerged unable to provide for their families, putting them into an even worse state of affairs. Despite this, the Gloucestershire magistrates, meeting to discuss the conditions of the prison, perhaps unsurprisingly, attacked the press coverage, insisting that Charles Beale had had perfectly adequate treatment. One magistrate went as far as to joke that some people had been committed many times, so the prison must be quite good or the offenders wouldn't keep returning to it.
However, sense finally prevailed, and it was decided new measures should be taken. New windows were installed to warm the building. Surgeons examined prisoners upon entry to assess their medical needs, and the prison diet was changed. This was all too late for Charles Beale. He was buried on the 17th of October, 1842, a week after his death, with a large crowd coming to pay their respects.
We now move south towards Cirencester, stopping off at the woods in Chedworth.
Poaching has been a common activity in the Cotswolds for hundreds of years. Generally, the landowners whose pheasants, rabbits and other game the poachers are after have always accepted that a bit of local petty theft goes with the territory. There are very few country people who, if a large cock pheasant strays into their garden to peck at the wheat kernels accidentally spilled on their lawn, won't pop a bullet in their air gun and snaffle the bird for the pot. However, there have always been a few that poach for financial gain. These are a bigger problem.
Giles Coats, a man with a poor reputation who didn't care whom he crossed, was one such poacher who regularly raided the well-known Cotswold estate at Chedworth. In his day job he was a clock and watchmaker, but the locals knew him also to be a professional poacher. Born in 1783, he grew up in the Chedworth area and came from a perfectly respectable local family. In 1805, he married Sarah Restall in Northleach Church, and they had 5 children. He looked like any other middle-aged man, but he was recognizable from a distance because of his distinctive walk and round-shouldered posture. The estate in Chedworth was owned by a successful barrister, Lord Stowell. Covering thousands of acres on both sides of the River Colne, the estate employed a large number of people. The head gamekeeper, George Simper, was only 2 years older than Giles Coats, and had also spent many years living in Chedworth. He was a respectable, honest family man who worked hard to protect his employer's land and assets. But this didn't matter to a man like Giles Coats.
On the 20th of October, 1833, in the middle of the night, Giles Coats crept into Chedworth woods to see what he could poach. George Simper was on duty that night, and after hearing shots from the woods, went to investigate, assuming poachers to be at work. He came across Giles, confronted him, and tried to take his double-barreled shotgun away from him. Giles, however, not keen to be captured, hit the percussion cap with his knife, causing the gun to fire. George was hit by the blast and seriously injured. Giles fled the scene, leaving George Simper lying on the ground to his fate. It was a cold, damp autumn night, but fortunately Simper was discovered and carried home. His injuries were so serious that he was expected to die that night. Giles, meanwhile, escaped undetected.
Giles soon realized that George Simper knew exactly who he was. After all, they'd both grown up together in the Chedworth area. He decided to travel to London, where he grew a beard to disguise himself. However, he didn't realize just how much publicity would be generated by the incident. A reward of £50 was soon offered for information on his whereabouts. Handbills were posted which read, £50 reward. Whereas on the evening of Sunday, October the 20th, George Simper, gamekeeper to the Right Honourable Lord Stowell at Chedworth in the county of Gloucester, while endeavouring to secure Giles Coats of Chedworth aforesaid, who he detected in a wood in the unlawful pursuit of game, was deliberately fired at within the distance of 1 yard. So began the handout, the rest of it describing Giles's appearance. It even appeared in the newspapers. An ex-policeman called James Hall, now a farmer, was an acting parish constable in Northleach. It seems Giles had made the mistake of telling people where he planned to go, and James Hall followed him to London. For a whole month, James failed to locate the absconded poacher. Even then, London was a very large city. But in November 1833, Giles's luck ran out, and one night he happened to walk past James Hall in the street. James immediately recognized him, despite his disguise, and grabbed him. Giles tried to bribe him with a £5 note to let him go, but James refused, marching him to Bow Street Police Station, where he was taken into custody. He was tried and found guilty of the attempted murder of George Simper on the 29th of March 1834, and was facing a death sentence. However, the judge decided to spare Giles's life, instead sentencing him to be transported to Australia.
On the 12th of December 1834, Giles left his family for the last time and sailed off in the convict ship George III, en route to the Antipodes. Tragically, however, the ship was destined for disaster. It struck a rock in the mouth of the River Derwent on the 12th of April 1835 and was completely wrecked. Only a few lucky individuals survived. Giles was not amongst them. At least, we don't think he was. On the brighter side, George Simper's story had a happier ending. Despite his injuries, he survived another 24 years, dying in Yanworth on the 7th of August 1858, at the then impressive age of 77.
Our next story took place just a few miles from here, in the small village of Rendcombe.
But be warned, this tale is particularly sinister and gruesome. A young lady by the name of Sarah Moss lived in Rendcombe, working as a servant to the Reverend Bloxham at North Nibley. During this employment she started a relationship with a local farmer, and in the autumn of 1859, at 29 years old and still unmarried, she had her first daughter, Elizabeth Louisa Moss. Despite the baby's illegitimacy, Elizabeth was baptised and lived at the Moss family home, a secluded cottage near the vicarage on the Cheltenham Road. Sarah shared a room with her daughter, and they lived across the road from another respectable family called the Mealings. John and Mary Mealing had a large number of children, and their oldest son, William, worked as an agricultural labourer.
William was an independent man, having moved out of his family home at a young age to lodge with nearby neighbours, but by the autumn of 1859 he was lodging with the Moss family. Perhaps not surprisingly, in view of the close confines of the cottage, he developed a relationship with Sarah, and she became pregnant again in 1862. This time the relationship took a more conventional turn, and they were to be married in Rendcombe Church in October 1862. Sarah took her impending marriage very seriously, saving whatever money she could towards the cost of the ceremony and a dowry. William, on the other hand, was not such a stable man.
Once he'd been found sitting in a sort of trance in front of the unlit fire, freezing cold. Both his mother, Mary, and Sarah were extremely worried by his apparent illness. They cared for him, even sleeping in the same room to keep an eye on him. His condition seemed to improve for a while, but not for long. Not many days later, William complained to his mother of pain in his head, saying it was so bad he feared it might drive him out of his mind. Mary went to the local doctor for help, telling him that William was threatening to kill himself. She also told him that William had been praying aloud at night that he might not harm himself or anyone else. Dr. Lark promised to make up some medicine by 8 p.m. that night.
William stayed with his mother until about 7 p.m, when, against her advice, he left to go to Sarah's house. Mary insisted on accompanying him, and they all sat in Sarah's cosy room drinking tea together. When Sarah went to put her child to bed, Mary told her not to be alarmed, but that William was not himself. She recommended she hide any knives and implements out of his reach, just to be safe. William was a good man, and he had told his mother when he was ill and thought he might be going to die that she should offer the same love and care to Sarah that she'd shown to him. Eventually, Mary went home, everyone exchanging affectionate farewells. It wasn't long before disaster struck. In the early hours of Friday the 24th of October, 1862, William Mealing turned up at the home of local blacksmith Timothy Tarrant, who doubled as a parish constable. He'd known William his whole life and was his godfather. William said he'd come to Timothy's house to give himself up, for he had murdered Sarah at his lodgings.
Timothy sent his son to fetch Mr. and Mrs. Mealing. When they arrived, they stayed with William whilst Timothy went to investigate at Moss Cottage. Lantern in hand, he was able to enter through the unlocked front door. The cottage was shrouded in darkness, and he heard a child crying from upstairs. He knew something was certainly amiss, and noticing a light in a neighbour's house, went over to get some support. They all went upstairs to Sarah's room, spotting bloodstains as they neared the door, and found her lying in bed, stone dead.
Next to her was a shilling razor that belonged to William. It seemed clear what had happened. Sarah's 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth was in her little bed in the same room, completely distraught, staring at her dead mother. Timothy had no choice but to take William into custody, and it wasn't long before he was up before the Cirencester magistrates, and he was charged with the murder of Sarah Moss.
One Mr. Rudd, a specialist who had examined William a couple of weeks before, had said he was bordering on homicidal mania. 2 other surgeons also gave evidence, saying he was not of sound mind and was suffering from some kind of religious mania. Taking all of this into account, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter. He was condemned to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane, where he died 46 years later in 1908.
We travel now a few miles south to Cirencester, the titular capital of the Cotswolds, where we come across a tale of 19th century political corruption.
Feelings were running high in the lead up to the 1859 election to appoint 2 MPs for East Gloucestershire constituency. At this time, only male landowners with assets worth at least 40 shillings could vote. This meant that less than 20% of the male population were entitled to vote. Many supporters of both parties wanted to make sure those voters who'd previously voted the right way should do so again. So determined were the Liberal supporters that one of them, Henry Pole of Stratton House near Cirencester, gave the order to 3 of his servants to abduct a critical Cirencester voter in a bid to stop him voting Conservative.
When the servants were arrested and charged, the judge strongly advocated that Henry Pole should be charged rather than his servants, but despite this, he escaped without charge. His reputation, however, suffered considerably as a result. The victim of the abduction was John Kipplewhite, a Cirencester local who had a road building and groundworking business with a special expertise in drainage repair. In the mid-19th century, votes were not held in secret, so John Kipplewhite was known to Henry Pole as a Tory. They knew each other quite well, and so when Kipplewhite overheard Pole's gardener Mullis asking around for him as he was passing by the plough in Stratton, he went over to see what he wanted. Mullis explained that his boss Henry Pole needed a drain unblocking. The next day was the nomination day for the election, so John wanted to hear the proceedings in Cirencester for an hour or so, but he agreed to carry out the work for Pole before the nominations were to be announced.
He got to work at Stratton House for 4:30 a.m, managing a full 6 hours' work before heading into Cirencester for the nominations. He managed to take a break, enjoying a couple of pints in the butler's pantry before he left. After the nominations, Kipplewhite stopped in the plough, but drank nothing more, as he'd already had enough beer. Another of Pole's servants, Susanna Colburn, came in and asked Kipplewhite to join her in a pipe of tobacco, which he agreed to do. She then made him a cup of tea and took him upstairs. He drank the first cup of tea with enjoyment, but found the second not to his liking. It was darker in colour, and before he could inquire further about its funny taste, he drifted into unconsciousness. At around 9 p.m, he was smuggled onto a horse and carriage, driven by another servant called Jermyn Colburn. Mullis sat with the unconscious Kipplewhite in the back.
William Carpenter, who manned the Stratton Turnpike gate, observed Kipplewhite in the back of the coach as it passed, draped in a shawl and leaning over to one side. The carriage passed by Kipplewhite's house, much to the confusion of his wife, who spotted it going by and saw him in his hunched position. She was even more troubled when he failed to turn up at all that night. Shortly after 10 p.m, the carriage arrived at the King's Head in the village of Ashton Keynes in Wiltshire. Jeremy Colburn knew the landlord well and claimed he had picked up Kipplewhite as a wandering drunk. He asked the landlord if he could put him up for the night, which with some reservations he agreed to do. Susanna met them at the King's Head, and the 3 conspiring servants topped up Kipplewhite's drugs to keep him quiet until after the election. They stayed for an hour or so before leaving. After a while, the landlord became worried for Kipplewhite's health. But fortunately he seemed to pull through and awoke to find himself in a strange room, in a strange bed. He hadn't the faintest idea where he was or what he was doing there.
He set off full pelt for home, paying 6pence for his night's accommodation before he left. On the way, he began to feel ill again, but fortunately he was picked up by a carriage, taken to the Bear Inn and given some brandy and a cup of tea. A local surgeon deduced that he'd been drugged with a narcotic. After a few hours' sleep, against all odds, Kipplewhite managed to register his vote. The 3 servants responsible for the affair were all brought to justice and charged under the Corrupt Practices Prevention Act of 1854. The mastermind behind it all, the influential Henry Pole, escaped prosecution entirely. Kipplewhite survived the poisoning and went on to live a normal life.
Moving west, we come to another classic Cotswolds town, Painswick. It sits high on the western escarpment and is the location for a particularly grim tale.
A resident at the time of Henry VIII was one Sir Anthony Kingston. He was a staunch, indeed fanatical royalist who inherited the manor of Painswick from his father. He'd gathered a small army to help King Henry suppress the Pilgrimage of Grace, a Catholic uprising that started in Yorkshire, an action for which Kingston was awarded a knighthood.
He also became an agent for the king in his efforts to punish those who had supported the rebels. One such, the Mayor of Bodmin, got a message from Kingston that he would like to visit on such and such a date. The mayor was keen to impress and set up a dinner fit for a king. Before they sat down, Kingston said he wanted a gallows to be set up for a hanging that must take place after the meal. The mayor arranged it, and a dinner of great generosity was enjoyed by all. It was only after the meal that Kingston revealed that the gallows was for the mayor himself. For the support he had supposedly given to the rebels, he was to be hanged in his own garden.
There is a story that the very last man hanged by the Painswick hangman was brought to him with great kerfuffle and urgency in the middle of the night by Kingston himself. The hangman, having been dragged from his bed, was not in the best of moods, and he hurriedly took the unfortunate victim, who was already hooded, gagged and bound, straight to the gallows and hanged him. It was only the next morning, when he came to cut him down from the rope and remove his hood, that he discovered it was his only and much-loved son. It's hardly surprising that this was the very last person over whose head he placed the hanging noose. Here endeth tonight's tour of horrific tales in the Cotswolds. We've had brutal prison conditions in Windrush and Northleach, as well as murders, poachers and poisoners in Cirencester and beyond. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and check out our Halloween guidebooks, following the link in the description. If you enjoy horrific tales, you can find even more on our sister channel. Join us again soon, when we'll be back to show you the beauty of the region, the picturesque villages and wonderful stately homes.